34 years ago, a 26-year-old mother of 3 children left the streets of Reading, Pennsylvania in the early hours of the morning and was never seen alive again. Her body was found later that same day, beaten and strangled, dumped along a rural trail road in Perry Township, Berks County. 3 children lost their mother that day. A 9-year-old girl named Tamika, 2 younger boys who were so small they would grow up with almost no memory of her at all. Her name was Anna Jean Kane. And the people who loved her wanted the world to know exactly who she was, not the way she was described in the headlines that followed her death, but the way her daughter described her 34 years later when she finally stood before cameras and spoke. Anna was, in Tamika's words, very outgoing, not afraid of anything, very honest, blunt, and caring. She was a firecracker, she was a mother. And she was 26 years old when someone beat her, tied baling twine around her neck, strangled the life out of her, and drove her body miles from where she was killed and left her along a trail road like she was nothing. But the most chilling part of this case is not just what happened on the night of October 22nd into October 23rd, 1988. The most chilling part is what happened 2 years later when the killer sat down, wrote a letter, sealed the envelope with his own saliva, and mailed it to the local newspaper. A letter signed by a concerned citizen. A letter filled with details about the crime that only the person who committed it could possibly know. A letter that investigators immediately recognized as the work of the killer himself. And a letter that he did not know would one day carry his DNA directly into the hands of the people looking for him. This is not a story about a criminal who was caught quickly. This is the story of a man who killed a mother of 3, wrote a taunting letter to a newspaper 2 years later, and then lived in the same Berks County community for decades afterward. Dying of natural causes in 2018 at age 58, 4 years before DNA technology and a genetic genealogy laboratory finally matched that sealed envelope to his name. But let's go back to the beginning. In October 1988, Berks County, Pennsylvania, was a working-class region of eastern Pennsylvania anchored by the city of Reading. A mid-sized industrial city that had once been one of the most prosperous manufacturing centers in the state and was by the late 1980s facing the same economic pressures that had hollowed out industrial cities across America. The surrounding towns, Hamburg, Birdsboro, Perry Township, were small communities connected by rural roads and trails cutting through the agricultural landscape of the county. People knew their neighbors. Violence of the kind that was about to happen was not something the community expected or had prepared itself to understand. Anna Jean Kane was 26 years old. She had 3 children, a daughter named Tamika who was 9 and 2 younger boys. She had recently moved from Reading to Birdsboro, another small Berks County community. She had been living an unstable life in the months before her death, moving several times across a short period, unemployed, struggling with circumstances that her daughter would later say the media never took the time to look past when they wrote about her. Her daughter Tamika would grow up to push back publicly against the way her mother was portrayed after her death, insisting that whatever her mother's struggles were, she was a loving, caring, honest woman who never deserved what happened to her. Anna was her mother, she was real, and she deserved to be remembered as a person. On the night of October 22nd into the early hours of October 23rd, 1988, Anna was in the Reading area, in the streets near Franklin Street and South 6th Street, an area of the city she was familiar with. She was last seen alive at approximately 1:00 a.m. on October 23rd in that location. Sometime between that last sighting and the following afternoon, someone approached her, and what followed was violent, deliberate, and brutal. October 23rd, 1988, Ontelaunee Trail, Perry Township, Berks County, Pennsylvania. On the afternoon of October 23rd, 1988, a body was found dumped alongside Ontelaunee Trail near Route 662 in Perry Township, a rural area several miles from where Anna had last been seen in Reading. She was quickly identified as Anna Jean Kane. She had been beaten severely, her face badly bruised, and she had been strangled with a length of baling twine tied around her neck. The Berks County coroner, William R. Fatora, confirmed the following day that Anna had died as a result of asphyxiation due to strangulation. She had been choked to death with a rope. The location where her body was found was not where she had been killed. Investigators determined immediately that Anna had been murdered elsewhere and her body transported to Ontolani Trail and left there. Someone had driven her body to that rural trail road, left her alongside it, and driven away. She had been dead for approximately 12 hours by the time she was discovered. DNA was collected from Anna's clothing and body and preserved as evidence. A male DNA profile was identified from the material collected. In 1988, that DNA profile could not be matched to any individual through the databases that existed at the time. Investigators documented it carefully, preserved it properly, and the investigation continued along every other available avenue. Pennsylvania State Police launched a full investigation. Every lead was pursued. Every possible connection between Anna and the people she knew in the reading area was examined. A cash reward of up to $10,000 was offered through Crime Alert Berks County for information leading to an arrest. Tips came in from the community. None led to a name strong enough to charge. The trail went cold. 3 young children grew up without their mother. Tamika, the oldest at 9, carried memories of Anna through her entire life. Her younger brothers were too small to hold on to any. The question of who had killed their mother was something they lived with from that day forward, carried in silence the way children carry things that adults cannot answer for them. Then, in February 1990, something happened that investigators had never seen before in connection with this case. The Reading Eagle, the local newspaper that had published a front-page story about Anna Kane's murder and had run subsequent coverage asking the community for information, received a letter. It was anonymous, signed only as a concerned citizen, but what was in that letter stopped investigators cold the moment they read it. The letter contained details about the murder of Anna Jean Kane that had never been published, details that no member of the public could have known. Details that could only have come from someone who was there. Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Daniel Womer would later describe it at the 2022 press conference in the most direct terms possible. The content of that letter led investigators to believe that whoever wrote it had committed the homicide. This was not a tip from a witness. This was not speculation from someone who had read the newspaper. This was communication from the killer, written 2 years after the murder, addressed to the local newspaper, signed with a fake identity, and sealed with an envelope that the killer had licked shut. Investigators immediately tested the saliva on the envelope for DNA, and what they found was the second piece of evidence that would anchor this case for the next 3 decades. The DNA from the saliva on that envelope was a perfect match to the male DNA profile recovered from Anna Kane's clothing. The person who wrote that letter was the person who killed her. The killer had contacted the newspaper, he had written about what he had done, and he had sealed the envelope with his own saliva, leaving behind a DNA sample that matched the one he had already left on his victim's clothing 2 years earlier. Now investigators had 2 matching DNA profiles from the same unknown man. They had the biological evidence from the 1988 crime scene and the DNA from the 1990 envelope. They entered the profile into every available law enforcement database. They searched, they waited, no match came back. The killer had no prior felony record that required a DNA sample. His profile was not in CODIS when the national database was formally launched in 1998. His name was not in any investigative file connected to the case. He had written to the newspaper in 1990, matched the DNA, and disappeared back into the Berks County community as completely as he had before, as if he had never written anything at all. The years passed, the decades accumulated, the reward sat unclaimed. The file remained open at the Pennsylvania State Police. The children of Anna Jean Kane grew up, became adults, had their own lives, and in some cases their own children. All of them carrying the unanswered question of their mother's death with them through everything. Tamika Reyes, Anna's daughter who had been 9 years old when her mother was killed, later said she had thought she might never see this day, but she had held on to hope. Her younger brothers did not even have the memories to hold. In 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police made a decision that would change everything. They submitted the DNA profile from the Anna Kane case to Paraben Nanolabs, the Virginia-based private forensic DNA company that had helped solve dozens of cold cases across the country using forensic genetic genealogy. Paraben ran the analysis, uploading the profile to public genealogy databases where millions of ordinary Americans had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to research their ancestry. From the partial matches that came back, genealogists built a family tree, working backward through generations and forward again, narrowing down the possibilities branch by branch. The tree led to one name, Scott Grimm, a man from the Hamburg area of Berks County, Pennsylvania, a man who had been 26 years old in October 1988, the same age as Anna Kane when she was murdered. A man who had lived in the same Berks County community for years after the crime. A man who in 2002 had been arrested by the Exeter Township Police Department in a harassment case in which he had been mailing intimidating letters to a former business partner, a harassment charge. A minor offense, not the kind of offense that required a DNA sample to be entered into CODIS. That specific gap between what CODIS required and what Scott Grimm had done was precisely the gap that had protected him for 34 years while investigators searched for him without knowing his name. Investigators obtained a direct DNA sample from Scott Grimm. Officials did not publicly elaborate on exactly how they obtained it. What they confirmed was that the Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory then performed a direct comparison between Grimm's DNA profile and the two existing profiles in the case file. The DNA from Anna Kane's clothing collected in 1988 and the DNA from the saliva on the envelope the killer had sent to the Reading Eagle in 1990. All three profiles matched the same contributor, Scott Grimm. Trooper Womer described it at the press conference with the precision of someone who had waited a long time to say these words out loud. We were able to take the direct sample from Scott Grimm. We had our Pennsylvania State Police Lab do a direct comparison to the DNA from the letter in 1990, as well as the original evidence from the victim's clothing, all of which showed the same contributor being Scott Grimm. His DNA profile was on all of those items. There was only one problem. By the time that confirmation was complete in August 2022, Scott Grimm was already dead. He had died of natural causes on May 31, 2018, at the age of 58 in Berks County, 4 years before his name was ever connected to what he had done on the night of October 22 into October 23, 1988, and 2 years after he had sent that letter to the Reading Eagle. He had lived 30 years after murdering Anna Kane. He had lived in the same county where her children grew up without her. He had died without ever being questioned, without ever being a suspect, and without ever spending a single day being held accountable for what he had taken from 3 children on a night in October 1988. August 18, 2022, Berks County, Pennsylvania. On August 18, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police and the Berks County District Attorney's Office stood before the press and announced that the 34-year-old cold case of Anna Jean Kane had been solved. The killer was Scott Grimm, a local man, a Berks County resident. A man who had been 26 years old when he murdered a 26-year-old mother of 3, who had then written a letter to the local newspaper 2 years later filled with details only he could have known. Who had sealed that envelope with his own saliva and handed investigators the second piece of DNA evidence that would eventually confirm everything. And who had lived freely in Berks County for 3 decades before dying of natural causes in 2018. Berks County District Attorney John T. Adams stood before the cameras and said something that was honest and heavy at the same time. I know that in some respects, since he is deceased, he will never face justice as we all would hope for this homicide, but we solved it. We gave some closure to the family. Tamika Reyes, Anna Kane's daughter, who had been 9 years old when her mother was murdered and was now 42, stood before cameras and spoke words that carried 34 years of weight in every syllable. I didn't think I'd see this day, but I had hope. My emotions are all over the place. Happy, sad, angry, she said she was lucky enough to have known her mother, to have at least a little time with her. But her brothers, she said, don't remember Anna at all. And she said what she needed the public to understand about who Anna Kane really was. She was a person. She was my mother. We loved her and still do. She never got the opportunity to make a change. We will always wonder why. Why did it have to be this way? There was no arrest. There was no trial. There was no courtroom where Tamika and her brothers could sit in the gallery and watch Scott Grimm answer for what he had done. There was only a name, a press conference, a photograph of Anna Jean Kane displayed at the podium, and the knowledge that the man who had taken her mother from her had lived 30 more years in the same county, died in his bed, and was only named after his death because a sealed envelope and 2 matching DNA profiles had waited patiently across 3 decades for exactly the right technology to read them. The Anna Jean Kane case leaves behind lessons that every American can carry into their lives today. First, this case proves something that investigators and families of cold case victims need to hear clearly: DNA evidence properly preserved never expires. A male DNA profile collected from a victim's clothing in 1988 and saliva collected from a letter's envelope in 1990 together waited 34 years without losing their value. If you are a family member of an unsolved cold case victim, ask the investigating agency 2 direct questions. Is the biological evidence still preserved, and has it been submitted for forensic genetic genealogy analysis? CODIS requires a prior felony conviction. Forensic genealogy through organizations like Paraben Nanolabs can find a suspect through their relatives even if the suspect died years ago. Second, this case is one of the most dramatic examples in American criminal justice history of a killer making a catastrophic mistake out of arrogance. Scott Grimm had gotten away with murder for 2 years when he decided to write that letter to the Reading Eagle. He wrote about what he had done. He sealed the envelope with his own saliva. He mailed it. He thought he was untouchable. That letter is the reason his name was confirmed 34 years later. Arrogance left the evidence that DNA eventually read. Third, this case is a reminder about how we talk about victims of violent crime. Anna Jean Kane's daughter spent years pushing back against the way her mother was described in media coverage, reduced to a label rather than treated as a full human being. She was a person. She was a mother. She was a firecracker who was outgoing and honest and caring and full of life. Every victim of violent crime, regardless of their circumstances at the time of their death, is a full human being whose life mattered to the people who loved them. And finally, this case proves that no amount of time, not 34 years, not the death of the killer himself, can permanently close the distance between a crime and the truth. Scott Grimm thought he had carried his secret to his grave. He had not. The DNA he left behind on Anna Kane's clothing in 1988 and on a letter's envelope in 1990 carried that secret for him, and when the right technology arrived, it delivered that secret to the people who had been waiting for it. If this story moved you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. Every name behind these cold case files is a real person, a real family, and sometimes a truth that waited far longer than anyone should ever have to wait to finally be told. Thank you for watching until the very end. See you in the next case.